All right, so we're in the chapter 3 section of our review. It's going to cover sections 3.1 to 3.3. Understand that the test is going to be both chapters 2 and chapters 3, but only up to section 3.3. It's going to be about 60% chapter 2, about 40% chapter 3. Okay, but you do need to know the stuff from chapter 3 very, very well. In chapter 3, we start dealing with equations, okay? And then this is different from expressions that we're seeing in chapter 2, where we have to evaluate. In equations, we have to solve. So if we look at number 1 in your review, you have 2x minus 10 equals 0. Now in this case, we have an equation because there's an equal sign, all right? That's the difference between an equation and an expression. All right, so you have 2x minus 10 equals 0. Remember that the two rules of algebra tell us, 1, you have to isolate the variable, and number 2 is that whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. Whenever we're isolating the variable, we always work from the outside in, so we find the farthest thing from the variable and move it to the other side first. In this case, it's this negative 10. Now what this negative 10 tells us, what this negative 10 tells us is actually plus minus 10, right? Remember, we're trying to think of all of our subtractions as addition of negatives, so we can separate the terms from each other. This plus minus 10, the inverse operation of that would just be plus positive 10. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So you end up with 2x equals 10. And you keep working from the outside in. And then you have this 2 that is multiplied to this x, and the inverse operation will be to divide it by 2. Divide both sides by 2, you end up with x equals 5, okay? So there you actually get an answer for the variable. That is what solving algebraic equations looks like. Now, this is in standard form, 2x minus 10. That would be the standard form, but sometimes you don't get it in standard form, like we do in problem number 9, which is 5 minus x equals 2. 5 minus x equals 2. So in this case, we have a non-standard form. Okay, we don't have a 0 on one side, but we still do the same thing. We work from the outside in. Here we have a positive 5. To be able to take it out of this side of the equation, we have to subtract 5. And you subtract 5 from both sides. When you subtract 5 from both sides, you end up with negative x equals negative 3. Now in this case, you have a negative x, and that's not what you want. Remember, you have to isolate the variable, which means you only want the x by itself. In this case here, that negative x actually means negative 1 multiplied to x, and we can factor out that negative 1. Remember that whenever you have a variable with no coefficient in front of it, it actually means that there's a 1 in front of it. When you factor those two things out, since it is multiplication of those two things, this is what it looks like. And you end up with negative 3 on the other side. Now, this negative 1 multiplied to that x, the inverse operation will be to divide by negative 1. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other, and you end up with x equals 3. And that's your final answer. Please make sure that your final answers are not negative variables, okay? They have to be positive variables. If you look, you have questions like number 21 and 23, where you kind of do the same thing that we did in chapter 2, where you have to make equations using the paragraph form, okay? So you have to be able to do problems like that as well. Check the back of the book for the answers for that, but I'm not going to do them here in this part of the review. Moving on to section 3.2, equations that reduce to linear form. Kind of the same thing that we've been doing, except now you're going to end up using some other operations like distributive property, like combining like terms. So we can go ahead and do let's do number 29. So number 29. What number 29 tells us is 2 times x plus 3 equals 6 times x minus 3. And that may look familiar because this was actually a question on one of your quizzes. You're going to go ahead and multiply using the distributive property. Remember, whatever is outside, you have to multiply to both terms of the of this side of the equation. So you end up with 2x plus 2 times 3, which is 6. Same thing here, okay? So you end up with 6x minus 6 times 3, which is going to be 18. Okay, now you have to decide. You can decide to either keep the variable on one side and all the constants on the other, or just keep the variable on this side and the constants on the other side. We're going to go ahead and work with this negative here and understand that we add 18 to both sides, and we're going to keep the variables on the right side. Add 18 to both sides, then you end up with 2x 6 plus 18 is going to be 24. Plus 24 equals 6x, all right? Now we want to move this variable to the other side so we can isolate the variable on one side by itself. Minus 2x, and that gives you 24 on one side and 4x on the other side. Now this 4 is multiplied to that x, so you're going to divide by 4, divide by 4. 24 divided by 4 is going to be 6 equals x, and then that's your final answer. Notice how the x is not negative, it has to be positive x, okay? Alright, so you have to be able to combine like terms, and for that you use PEMDAS. Remember PEMDAS, we're going to be using PEMDAS throughout the whole entire year, so make sure that you know what PEMDAS is. And then solving equations that sometimes have fractions. So solving equations in fraction form. Like for example, number 31. Number 31, you have 2 over 3x minus 1 over 6 equals 9 over 2. Alright, we work from the outside in, same exact thing as always, okay? This is going to be the farthest thing from the variable, so we're going to add 1 over 6 to both sides. But we come into a little bit of a problem because whenever we're adding fractions, we need to have the same denominator. So we use the least common multiple to find the same denominator of 2 and 6. Multiples of 2, so we do 2, 4, 6, 8. Multiples of 6 are going to be 6, 12, 18. 6 is the least common multiple of the 2. So we know that we have to turn this fraction of 9 over 2 into a fraction over 6. What do you do to 2 to get 6? You multiply by 3. Whatever you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top when you're dealing with fractions. 2 times 3 is going to be 6. 9 times 3